when I started in the construction industry, you were paired with this gravelly old foreman that all he wanted to do was scream and shout at you, whereas now I think the ability for younger people to come into the industry and really be mentored, that's a big change from when I started.
Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Land Development Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan Glick. I have a quick housekeeping item for you here before we get into our conversation with today's guest. So I'll intro him in just a second. But before we do that, just a quick favor to ask for all of you tuning in. We've been having more and more people listen to the show every week. Super grateful for all of you tuning in. And when I look out at the Apple and Spotify reviews that we have out there, I'd really appreciate it if you guys could take a moment and even pause this episode and go over there. If you're on Spotify, just leave us a rating over there. If you're on Apple, if you take the time to do a rating and review, that would go a long way to, again, it helps us get in front of more people who are searching for land development content. So again, hit that pause button really quick, go leave us that rating and review, and then come right back over here for our conversation. All right, with that said, I'm excited to have with me today Ian Young. Ian is the Director of Development at Parkland Communities based out of the Atlanta area. Ian, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Looking forward to talking with you today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I was telling you before we pushed record here that you've had quite the background in your career leading up to this point. And usually I ask people, hey, tell me how you got to where you're at today. And it's kind of a straight path to get there. I mean, not always predictable, but it's kind of a straight path and it doesn't have as quite the breadth of experience that I feel like you've had. And so I don't want to jump over some of that. And maybe where we can start is you obviously started your career in Scotland and the UK, and you earned your degree in civil engineering over there. Can you talk a little bit about those early days and kind of what you were up to and kind of how you got your start in the industry there?
Yeah, so I grew up in the north of Scotland, but I went to university in Glasgow, and I specifically picked a civil engineering course that allowed me to, go to school for 6 months, and then we had, it was part of the course, we had to go out and work for 6 months. So we had a lot of construction companies come to the university, and we would have placements. So, after our course was 5 years, but after 5 years, you had 2.5 years of experience in the industry. And, pretty much every summer, you kind of got out, you could go out and do something different every summer. So, during my time, in school per se, I worked in oil fabrication yards. I worked on a stormwater project in my hometown. I went and worked on a shopping mall in the north of England. So, it allowed us to get some real world experience. So you weren't coming out of school, like a greenhorn, as they say. It definitely allowed that period of time. It gave you some time to maybe kind of a little bit figure out what kind of direction, whether you wanted to be in an office or whether did you want to be out in the field. So yeah, that was kind of the main advantage of doing kind of 6 months in, 6 months out.
Yeah. So I imagine your initial work on these projects was from an engineering angle. Is that correct?
Well, the way it worked in the UK is and again, it was, this was back, I'm not going to tell you how long ago, but it was back whenever. So what they would do would be, they would basically pair you up with an older guy, and he ran the trades, and you were kind of considered the section or project engineer. And effectively, like some of the jobs you turned up, they'd literally be like, okay, here's the plans. This is your, foreman. Listen to what he wants. And you would pretty much end up just being a surveyor for him, but also, a quantity surveyor as well type thing, where they'd come in and be like, hey, the plans say X, Y, and Z, but we think it should be A, B, and C. Go get us an answer. So you were the conduit from the field guys to the office and the plans. So I mean, a lot of the time I just started out, I was just a surveyor starting out, and you would go out with, back then it was theodolites and total stations and labels, and you'd be giving them line and label, and that's how you learned. And you had to learn pretty quickly because that foreman probably had about 30, 40 years of experience on me, and I was like 18 or 19, and they were not the most patient of people. Some were really good, but a lot of them were just like, you better learn this quick. So you had to learn by baptism of fire. So that it was pretty stressful, but it allowed you to get up to speed pretty quickly. And I ended up doing a lot more surveying, and what back in the UK it's kind of more called a quantity surveyor slash project manager, where you had to learn foundations, rebar, concrete, all that stuff. You had to learn how to do takeoffs and help the guys that physically put all that stuff on the ground. So yeah, it was a little bit different before the transition to the States. Anyway, it was a lot more project management and surveying for sure.
Yeah. Well, about speaking of the US, so you at a certain point you made the decision to move to the US and continue your career here. What brought you to the US?
I had this grand idea that a lot of people from Scotland get a great idea of going on a little bit of a walkabout. So my plan was to go around the world for 2 years and bounce around. And I hit the United States, and I met a young lady, and that was the end of my 2 year around the world trip. I met my wife in Ohio, and I tell everyone I crashed and burned in Ohio, on my 2 year around the
Yeah.
world. So, but it all worked out very well. So no complaints.
All right. So you ended up in Ohio, and assuming you continued your career in engineering there, or did you get into the land development side at that point?
Well, so when I came to Ohio, I really wanted to get into heavy construction, but the heavy construction field was very unionized, so I didn't have a union card. So I ended up working for a surveyor and did survey work to start with, and then from that transitioned into the office. And their biggest client was a residential home builder. And after a couple of years of doing that, I ended up jumping ship onto the client side. So I started working for residential home builders, and that's how I kind of got my start in residential home building.
Okay. And I saw, I mean, you've worked for some big builders, in your career.
Yeah.
And you also had looks like a stop at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers where you did some projects with them as well. What was that? How did you get involved in with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers?
So I would love to have said I had a massive crystal ball in 2008, 2009 when the crash happened, but basically I got a call one day from a company, and they were like, "Hey, we're working on this project. We do military housing. Would you like to come down and see it?" So flew down to Louisiana, Alexandria, Louisiana, looked at a post there, thought that was fantastic. I really wanted to work on military. The military housing was in pretty bad shape at that time, and really needed upgraded big time. Just throughout the United States. Unfortunately, my wife was like, "I'm not moving to Louisiana," which nothing wrong with Louisiana, but it was a little bit further away. We had a young daughter at the time, and we wanted to be somewhat close to a little bit of a metropolitan area. So ended up getting a job at Fort Benning in just south of Atlanta, and worked on a military housing project there for a number of years. And that project kind of came to an end. I was still on the post, and they had a base realignment and closure project, so a big brag project. And then I jumped on that on board. So I was really I was really a project manager for the Corps of Engineers, but again, not by design, just by pure luck. I mean, they had like a $2 billion building program. They were building tank tracks, hospitals, vehicle facilities, brand new fire station. I mean, you name it, they built everything. Weapons facilities. I mean, they basically moved the School of Armor from Fort Knox to Fort Benning, and that was just a massive building program for 6 years. And my last project was working on the brand new hospital at Fort Benning, which was fantastic, you know.
Yeah, what was the difference between, you've worked, like I said, you'd worked for some larger builders, and you've worked for some maybe more local or regional builders. What has been the difference between, working in those two different types of environments?
Yeah, I think I would, I think the biggest thing is working for a national builder. It's generally a larger builder is, they've got shareholders they've got to answer to. So that affects the business a little bit different than maybe a private builder. A private builder, it's kind of like oil tankers, like the the large build, residential builders, the Hortons, the Lennars, that are doing 80, 90,000 units throughout the United States in a year. They're like a mile and a half tanker that just it takes them longer to turn. Whereas when you're on a private home builder, there's equity issues with private builders generally, but they can pivot a lot quicker, and that's probably the biggest thing is, and then the the devolution of power, not power per se, but just the you know you got the C-suite sitting wherever in the country. They don't necessarily always have a finger on the pulse of what's going on in that
Right.
particular market, you know. And whereas maybe a private home builder is a little bit, has that ability to really have their finger on the pulse and then pivot to it as well, you know.
Yeah.
It's a little bit harder to explain to somebody that's sitting in Texas when you're sitting in Atlanta and you're like, look, this is really a good deal, and they've got 30 division presidents telling them that, hey, my deal is the best deal. And it's like, they've got to look at their equity from on a lot higher scale. So that makes it a little bit more challenging, I would say. And yeah, it just makes it just slightly different is what I would say.
Yeah. Well, then now you're at Parkland Communities. And so
Yeah.
you made a transition there. Can you, for those listening in that aren't familiar with Parkland Communities, can you describe what the company does?
So Parkland we're primarily based in Georgia right now. We've been in business just over 4 years. We're privately owned. Jim Jacoby is our owner. He's been in the business a long time. He's owned a home building in the past. He's owned an engineering company in the past. So Jim started up Parkland just over 4 years ago, and I jumped on pretty quickly on board. And we will build residential houses of any kind. We've got townhomes, we've got single family, primarily right now, but we're just scaling up. We're doing a lot of townhome built to rent townhomes, and we also have some single family uh, cottage product, as we call it, for sale as well. We've got some for sale product coming up, so we'll pivot to anything that in the residential field. And like I say, we're rapidly scaling up, and our intention is to continue to do build to rent in other markets in the future, and then obviously scale up on our for sale product as well.
Okay. And then your role there as the director of development, I know different titles mean different things at different companies and everything, but for you, it's obviously not, it's not a massive national company, but you as the director of development, what kind of hats are you wearing under that role?
So I've been very fortunate. When I first started, there was 13 of us in the company. About 12, 13 of us in the company. So obviously you were wearing a lot more hats, and that's fine. In the past, I had done a lot of acquisition, um, managed the engineering, and then managed the development side. So as things have transitioned over the last couple of years, very fortunately, we have I've got a gentleman in our office, and he takes care of all the due diligence stuff. So as soon as a deal comes in the door, he's taking care of that, and we work together on that front. I'll help him out on anything that he needs, but that's his primary focus. And just in the last couple of months, since the start of the year, actually, we now have an in-house engineer, so we're doing our own plans in-house. But prior to that, it would be my responsibility to get the engineering plans, bid that out, pick an engineer, get everything, submitted, and get an LDP permit so that we can go. And then, primarily right now, thankfully, they've taken over a lot of those duties that I was doing. And now my primary focus on, I can safely say now that we've got an in-house engineer, I get a pretty good set of plans. So I don't have to spend a huge amount of time with contractors going through plans. But effectively, what I do is take the plans, bid the project out. It's my responsibility to price it out, present that to our owner, and then we've the second a deal comes in the door, we're penciling it anyway, what we think it's going to cost, what are the things on it. And, that's a constant evolution of, hey, as we go through the due diligence, as we go through the engineering, what are all the things that, what's that going to cost? What's that going to cost? And constantly having conversations on that. A lot of the municipalities, I think that's why, most people now will not buy a piece of property until you have an LDP permit in hand, because, municipalities are throwing up a bunch of stuff through the design process that, come out of left field and, can add a huge amount of cost to development, and you got to fight that. And so that, that's kind of where we're at. And, effectively, once I get LDP, we cost it out, give it to them, we get the thumbs up, then I pick it up and take it through development, and get it turned over to our homes guys pretty much. And generally we're looking at an 8 to 12 month turnaround most of the time, depending upon the project. So that's our objective, is try and get that turned around in that 8 to 12 month period. And really that's my main focus right now, is dealing with the contractors pretty much. And to be honest with you, over the years, I've worn many different hats, and I realized pretty quickly, I was like, I like having my feet in the dirt. Sitting in an office all the time, Matt, I very quickly realized that was not my thing,
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes complete sense. You mentioned the in-house engineer. So I'm curious, from your perspective, for companies that don't have in-house engineers, is there a certain point in time in a company where that could make sense? Like, is it more of an efficiency thing? Is it a cost thing? Is it what ends up driving that type of decision?
I think that, a lot of what I would call the mom and pop engineers that used to be around in the days before. So, you could, and a lot of, I'm thinking maybe, 15 years ago, and, in the last maybe 10 years time period, a lot of those mom and pop engineers that really had, relationships with municipalities, tight relationships, so that you could get your plans turned around. They could have conversations with the engineers. A lot of that's been consolidated. They've sold out to bigger engineers, and that bigger engineer sold out. So a lot of the engineers, they became so big that maybe, if you're not the biggest client, you don't get the greatest of service,
Yeah.
And for us, again, it kind of goes back to that, we're kind of light and nimble on our feet, and we want to move quickly. Some of these other engineers, if they've got 10 or 15 clients, I'm not their number one client,
Right.
and that's fine. But for us, I don't want to be, number 10 on the list, because, time is money, and we got to move. So, and, again, because everything's consolidated down, they've got a lot bigger overhead. So the cost was getting, more expensive for the same set of plans that you maybe, whatever you spent 10 years ago was, maybe I'm exaggerating a little bit, but it's double what it used to be. And you're not getting them as quickly, and there's a lot of problems getting, the process takes longer. Whereas, we don't have a huge amount of projects. We've got 5 to 10 projects, whereas some of these other engineers may have, 30, 40, 50 projects. So
Right.
you just don't get the same level of service that you got in the past, and that's, cost is a factor, but really it's just level of service, to be honest with you. Getting our plans through, and, the municipalities become a lot more difficult to deal with. And if you do not sit on them, you don't get your plans.
Yeah.
And that's the biggest thing for us is, there are certain municipalities that, there's a municipality in the Atlanta area, and everyone knows it's like, you submit your plans, you may wait 8 months to get your plans, but you got to be down there every day just bugging them, So, and, again, some of the bigger engineers don't have the ability to be, if you're trying to do that for 20 clients, it's difficult, So that's why for us, it just made more sense to have somebody in house so that effectively cut that timeline down so we can turn, you know, if you've got a property under contract and you burn 4 months waiting on your plans, that's difficult for a seller, and it could be difficult for us depending upon, how much money if you've got earnest money going out every month or whatever, and the clock is ticking and money's burning, you got to move. And that's the biggest thing for us.
This episode of the Land Development Podcast is brought to you by Groove. Groove gives you access to over 150 million parcel records across all 50 states, with key ownership information and attributes right at your fingertips. You can also overlay important layers like floodplains, wetlands, school districts, and many more. And when you talk to a landowner, you can track the entire conversation, calls, emails, and notes directly on the parcel. So a year or two later, when you reach back out, you'll know exactly how the last conversation went. Start your free trial today at letsgroove.com/signup. That's letsgroov.com/signup. All right, let's get back to the show. Well, let's switch gears here just a little bit to, I'm curious about, you've been involved in a lot of projects over the years. Do you have one that you kind of think back on that maybe is your favorite project that you worked on over the years, or one that really stands out in your mind, was maybe a big, a critical point in your career, or just a project that you'd be able to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably one that had absolute, and it was like, believe it or not, it was probably one of my first projects, and I had absolutely no concept of how technical it was. It was actually a brand new shopping centre in the north of England, and it was basically right in downtown, and there was a road split the project. So you can imagine, there was like a main roadway in downtown, and the mall was split into north and south, and it had a very complex geotech. It was basically built on sand, and they had like 4 different types of pile rigs, you know, all different types of foundations going on, raft foundations, secant board poured walls. We had one of the, imagine you had like, your local paper. We had the national, for that area, they had the area paper printing presses were right next door to us. And, this was old fashioned print presses, and, they had a tolerance of like, 1 or 2 millimeters that these things couldn't go out of tolerance. And we're, right around their building, and we're, banging in piles and all this kind of stuff, so, and just the technicalities of, everything was cast in place, concrete. It was very technical. And then they had some structural steel. We had like 3 tower cranes in the project. So that one there was probably the one where it was like, okay, that's, again, at the time, I learned in the space of 6 months, I probably learned more there about construction in 6 months than I did, you know, probably in my first 6 years coming to the States. And then again, that helped me when I went to the construction projects on Fort Benning, because they were pretty technical as well. There was probably the coolest project that I got to work on. Three projects on Fort Benning that were pretty cool. I got to work on the M1A1 Abrams instruction facility. So that was pretty cool to, when you join the army, they take you in and you go in one end of the building and they explain to you, this is the Abrams tank, and they basically pull it apart through different stages inside that building, and then it comes back out rebuilt at the other end. And that was pretty cool. And then, same thing, we did the one for the Bradley fighting vehicle, and then a weapons facility for the Third Infantry Division. That was pretty cool to see how they store like 6,000 weapons and things like that. That was pretty cool. So those are probably the ones that stand out the most.
Yeah. No, those are cool. Yeah, that's definitely some really cool experience that you've had. And the last thing that we do on the show is something called the lightning round, where I basically have 5 questions that I'll run by you. No gotcha questions, nothing like that. Just some straightforward things that I'm curious to get your thoughts on. And this next one kind of leads, or the first one kind of leads right into what we were talking about. Of when you think about your time in the land development space, what's been the biggest thing that, or the biggest change you think has happened in the land development space in your career so far?
I think honestly, one of the big things that I think has been fantastic in the industry is there's definitely been, like I say, when I started in the construction industry, you were paired with this gravelly old foreman that all he wanted to do was scream and shout at you. Whereas now, I think the ability for younger people to come into the industry and really be mentored, that's a big change from when I started, and I think it's fantastic. I think I think most companies, certainly in the residential building field, you know, we've hired 4 young interns this summer, and I think that's a big thing in the industry that maybe wasn't quite there 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago. Whereas now, there's definitely a big push to encourage younger people to get into the industry, and I think that's fantastic. So that's a big change that I think has been very positive for the industry across the board.
All right, next one. What's one piece of advice you'd give to someone who's just getting started in land development?
Don't be in a rush. I see a lot of people in a rush to think about this. A project start to finish, from the day it comes in the door to the day you complete all the units, can be anywhere. You're lucky to complete a start to finish in 2 years. It's a 3 to 5 year process. So you got to go through that whole process to understand it. And you might do it in one municipality. What happens if you want to move to somewhere else? They've got a whole different process. It's completely different doing residential in Florida than it is in Texas, than it is in Ohio. And just, you'll learn it, but you just got to understand that, hey, it's a 3 to 5 year process.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a segue right into the next question here, because you've obviously moved quite a bit in your career while you've been doing this. And any advice you'd give to someone else who's in the industry who's considering moving, things to think about?
Yeah, just don't be intimidated. I mean, think about it. It's the same stuff. That's what I tell people. I'm like, look, a house is a house is a house. From a land development perspective, you got to drive on a road to get to your house. You know what I mean? You got to flush the toilet. You got to turn the water on. You got to put the power on. It's Everyone will try and convince you that it's, oh my goodness, it's so technical, or it's the same stuff. You got to move dirt, you got to create roads. It doesn't matter. It may be just a little bit more technical, but if you just break it down to the simplistic things, it's not as intimidating to move from state to state. I can tell you that. If you think about it like that.
What's something that you miss about living in Scotland or the UK?
Probably miss my friends the most, and the sense of humor, slightly different sense of humor. They may have I don't know, if you've ever watched Monty Python, it's probably a little bit childish and stupid, but that's probably the one thing that I miss the most is, going to the pub with my friends is probably the one thing you're like, man, it'd be good to do that every so often. So that's probably it.
All right, last one here. How has your engineering experience helped you in the development industry?
Hugely. I mean, I think my 5 years in university was set a very good basis for my career as it's gone. It's helped me tremendously. Um, just laid a great groundwork. If you can get a good civil engineering degree or whatever kind of degree, or if you're doing real estate, I think get that basis and then try and get on board with a company. And like I say, most companies now, they want to teach you, they want you to learn this business. So yeah, my getting an engineering degree was invaluable for me for sure.
Well, awesome. With everything that you've talked about here is a little like a different path than anybody we've had on the show. So this is really good, really interesting. What's the best way for people to connect with you and learn more about Parkland Communities?
Definitely, just check out Parking Communities. We've got we're across all media platforms. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and we're pretty constantly posting about our projects. So yeah, that Parkland Communities. Just look us up, and LinkedIn as well. If anyone wants to reach out on LinkedIn, you know I'm on LinkedIn there. Just Ian Young Parkland Communities.
All right. Well, if those of you listening in, if you look down in the description of this episode, you'll see a link there to the show notes page, which will have links to everything that Ian was just talking about there, all the different pages and social media accounts and everything. So you can click on those, learn more about Parkland, follow Parkland Communities across social media, and connect with Ian on LinkedIn and everything. But Ian, I really appreciate you joining and taking the time. I know you've got
Thank you very much.
yeah, for sure. I know you got places to go, and but yeah, this was a great conversation, and again, I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yep, and for everybody listening in, we will talk to you all next week.